Hey, AP Euro students, coming back to you from my usual place. My new classroom, it seems, is my dining room. And I wanted to post one more lecture to finish up and wrap up World War I so that we can get started on the 1920s and 30s, which is the era between the wars. And I would like it if you guys could pull up your Chapter 25 reading packet. It looks like this. You'll find it on the website. And some of the things that I would think would be really useful for you to look at would be number 7, which is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, but also to look at the one primary source, which is really kind of intriguing here, is number 16. The Germans are informed of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. This is an actual first-person account of what it was like in the room where it happened when Germany is forced to sign the peace treaty at the end of the war. And also, I'll call your attention to the last one on the list here, which is number 19. This is actually an article from CNN from 10 years ago, 2010. I know it doesn't seem like 10 years ago is recent, but actually, considering the fact that World War I started in 1914, ended in 1918, and didn't technically officially end, at least not for Germany anyway, until 10 years ago. It's a pretty amazing thing. That is when Germany made its final payment in its reparations for the war 10 years ago in 2010. So that being said, I want to call your attention now to, let's talk about the end of the war and how it actually plays out in the very last year of the war. I left you last time talking about the Russian Revolution. And once Lenin had successfully taken power in Russia, remember that he signs a deal with Germany in order to keep his promise to the Russian people of peace, land, and bread. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk he signs with Germany, and this officially withdraws Russia from the war. This opens Germany up, and it gives Germans a breath of hope because this means that the two-front war is over, and now they can focus all of their troops solely on the Western Front, where the British and the French are hanging on for dear life. Everybody's running out of money, and this seems to give Germany the last shot that it really needs. But like I said, it takes a gamble, especially because it is at this crucial time that the Americans finally arrive. So once Russia officially withdraws from the war, Germany is able to last a final offensive. So they basically put everything they've got into this last offensive, which lasts from March to July of 1918. And they just launched this massive attack. It is actually, this period of the war is one of the most deadly of the entire war. But as a result, the Allies counterattack, especially because now the Americans have sent in 140,000 troops, and these troops are not exhausted from 4 years of war. They are fresh from training and young and strong and healthy. And so they meet the French and the British at the Second Battle of the Marne on July 18th, 1918. This battle is incredibly deadly, but the Germans put a lot into it. And in the end, they did not get the results they wanted because the Allies end up winning this war. The American soldiers end up helping to push the Germans back. At this point, the generals that are running the German military, the names of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they realize that the war is lost for them. They realize that Germany has no hope of winning this for several reasons. One of them, that the German economy is broken. People at home are starving. There are no more resources. There is no way Germany can continue to fight this war. They can't even fund it. So they try to sue for peace. But the Allies will not negotiate with their government because the Kaiser is still in charge. And the Kaiser does not want to end the war. The Kaiser is a bit delusional and he wants to continue to fight. So the generals convince William II to abdicate. You'll remember the word abdicate is important. It means to step down from power. So on November 9th, 1918, William II, the Kaiser of the German Empire, he's gone. He resigns from his position and he leaves. He actually ends up leaving Germany for a while. He goes to live in Austria. He spends some time living in other parts of Europe later on. But he resigns from the throne, and 2 days later, the Allies finally, after not agreeing to negotiate with the Kaiser, they finally recognize this new government, a republic, which has hastily been established in Germany. However, this republic is very left-wing. It is basically led by socialists under the leadership of Friedrich Ebert. So, however, the Allies don't care if he's a socialist or not. They're willing to negotiate with this new government because they seem much more legitimate, and everybody wants the war to end. So the armistice is signed on November 11th at 11 a.m. In 1918. That's 11/11 at 11 a.m. So it's a pretty easy date to remember in 1918. An armistice is basically an agreement to stop fighting. This came as a huge shock to Germany, to German people, in particular to German nationalists, because many of them believed that they had been stabbed in the back. Since socialism is often associated in Germany with the Jewish intellectual community, many of them start to develop this belief that this was a Jewish conspiracy, that the socialists and the Jewish community were one and the same, and that the Jews had done this to purposefully weaken Germany. Now, this is not true, since the majority of them, of the people in the German New Republic, were actually not Jewish at all. But of course, these German nationalists are shocked, and they're looking for someone to blame. And anti-Semitism had already been there. It was not something that was invented by Hitler. So they start to circulate this myth that Germany had been stabbed in the back by its own. We historians know today that that is not true. It's mostly a conspiracy that was crafted to lay the blame on someone rather defenseless at the time, for what happened to Germany. But the truth is, the generals themselves, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they realized that the war was lost before the Kaiser did and before the nationalists did. And this is really just a state of denial. But that being said, the war is over. A lot of people in Germany were happy that the war was over and didn't really see what was coming next. So when the war is over and everybody stops to look around after the dust settles, the casualties are counted up, and the human cost was staggering. No war had ever been this deadly before in human history, and no war would be until World War II, which was coming up next. The total number of soldiers that died was somewhere in between 8 to 9 million soldiers. This is worldwide, by the way. Please don't forget, it wasn't just French, German, and British, and Austrians, and Italians, and Russians. This includes soldiers from India, from Africa, from Asia, from America. So these are from Canada. These are soldiers from all over the world. This is a world war. 22 million soldiers were wounded or mutilated. They came home, many of them with amputated limbs, with shell shock. Many of them were blinded or permanently disfigured in some way. So this generation that lives through World War I, they nicknamed themselves the Lost Generation, because so many young men died needlessly and mercilessly and ruthlessly out in those battlefields. But it wasn't just that so many men died. They also felt lost because the war itself had been such a shock that many of them had trouble identifying as something. Many of them politically and nationally didn't quite know where exactly they fit in, but they were looking for a place to belong. And many of them would later turn to extreme right-wing nationalism, which really panders to this veteran sense of loss that they experience, especially in Germany, and this idea that they ought to be vindicated for what they sacrificed. We also have the first genocide one of the first genocides of the 20th century, I should say, which often isn't talked about very much in history books. It's often glossed over. But in 1915, there was a genocide of the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. The reason for this is that Armenia was a country that was in the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was crumbling already anyway. However, Armenians typically are Christian, And when the Ottoman Empire goes to war, and when they joined the World War I, and they primarily go to war against Russia, the Armenians betray the Ottoman Turks, or at least that's the way the Ottoman Turks saw it. The Armenians instead decided to support Russia, since Russia was also a primarily Christian Orthodox nation. As punishment for this so-called betrayal, the way the Ottoman Turks see it, they actually turned against the Armenians and systematically murdered and starved 1 million Armenians within 1 year. To this day, this is a point of conflict between Turkey and Armenia, since Armenia has continued to demand reparations, and Turkey has ever since then refused to apologize or even admit to what it did to the Armenian people. So this is still a really sore point between Armenia and Turkey today. Here you see some major battles that took place. I didn't get into too many of them. However, I have some readings on them that you can do in the reading packet. Some of the major battles here, of course, are the Battle of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, and the Battle of Gallipoli, which actually takes place in the Strait of the Dardanelles between Britain, Australia, and Turkey. And actually, this ends up being one of the more defining battles for the Australian military in Australia's history, and is still considered a national holiday in Australia. It was in this battle, of course, that they were fighting for access to the sea around Turkey, and fighting for control of that territory. And it's such a small, tiny territory, and so many men died fighting for it. So, and you see again, of course, in 1917, January of 1917, Germany resumed its unrestricted submarine warfare when they become desperate to break the stalemate. And it was at this point in April that the United States decides to actually enter the war. And they arrived just in time, of course, once an agreement is made between Russia and Germany. And the American soldiers are present at the Second Battle of the Marne, which also ends up being a hugely disastrous war for both sides, although Germany loses. And finally, the armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918. In 1919, we will see the peace conference and the treaty signed sometime between January and June of that year. So the story does not end there, though, and it doesn't mean that there was actually peace in Germany after World War I ends. There was actually a lot of upheaval, anger over the defeat, and a revolution starts in Germany as well. This one is not as well known about. For many years, actually, it was sort of brushed under the rug in Germany, especially when Hitler came to power. But Germany has its own November Revolution in the aftermath of World War I. As you can imagine, there was a lot of anger over the fact that Germany seemed to simply just surrender in the war. And then the question of what kind of government will Germany have now also comes up, and who's going to be running this government as well. After all, it was formed so hastily and so quickly that so many Germans actually got whiplash from looking at, how do we go from having a Kaiser one day and then literally overnight we have like a liberal republic. It just seemed like such a massive change to take place in such a short amount of time. So there were some divisions within Germany itself. You had, for example, the Social Democrats, who were very liberal and hadn't really supported the war, but they wanted a republic. And then you have the German Communist Party, who was adamantly against the war, more so than the Social Democrats. And they want Germany to now be a communist state. So they have a revolution in November. It's actually two. One of them takes place in Berlin, and one of them takes place in Munich. They failed because the Social Democrats actually end up turning to the German military. So the Social Democrats had not been huge supporters of the war, but when this revolution happens, the Social Democrats turned to the German military that had fought in the war and said, look, you can either side with us or you can side with the communists. And you'd rather have us in charge than the communists. And so the Social Democrats and the conservative German military, they side together they allied to crush the communist revolutions. And in this revolution, two of Germany's more famous communist leaders are killed. One is Rosa Luxemburg, and the other was his name was Liebknecht, and he was actually a Lutheran, a German Lutheran, whereas Rosa Luxemburg was Polish and Jewish. Both of them were killed in this, and this actually creates in Germany a fear of communism. They saw what happened in Russia. They saw how the Russian nobility had to flee for its lives, literally, and how this new communist government under Lenin was taking over the food supply, and starting this sort of new dictatorship. And Germany has a massive fear of communism. So moderate socialists, in their alliance with the military, they end up gaining power temporarily, but there's still going to be this enduring fear of communism, especially amongst the German bourgeoisie. This is something that Hitler will later exploit. Many people don't remember this, but actually, once Hitler comes to power in Germany, his first victims were actually communists. Before he began to truly violently target the Jewish community, he first punishes the communists or suspected communists. So, and by associating communism with the Jewish community, especially, Karl Marx himself was Jewish, although he was non-practicing, he was actually an atheist. He's able to exploit that and connect the two in order to say that they are both the enemies of the true German people. Austria-Hungary also has its own revolution. This will actually end the entire empire of Austria-Hungary. The Habsburgs will no longer rule. This is the end of the Habsburg, the Romanov, and the Hohenzollerns of these three empires. Because of everything that had happened in Austria and the fact that Austria was now on the losing side of this war, there's a lot of agitation coming from all these ethnic minorities. So this is something Austria had been dealing with for centuries, and now finally had really gotten to a point where there was nothing Austria could do anymore. All the ethnic minorities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire now want their national independence. And because of the exhaustion of the war, economically and physically exhausting, there's really nothing else that Austria can do at this point, and so the empire simply falls apart. Besides, the Allies, including the United States, now support self-determination or self-rule for all of these new nations that are going to emerge from what used to be Austria-Hungary. You've got now, instead of Austria-Hungary, now you've just simply got Austria, which will now be a small landlocked country, as well as Hungary itself. But now you have all these other new countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, which, by the way, is no longer around, but it was the South Slavic kingdom. It actually falls apart in 1992, and is still dealing with some of the repercussions of that. There were some parts of Austria-Hungary that ended up actually just joining with either Italy or Romania or Poland. Now, I want you guys to pay attention to that, because all of these countries we're talking about, Germany, under the control of the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, Germany feels that all of these territories rightfully belong to Germany, to his new empire, the new Reich that he will form. These regions, by the way, will be plagued by all kinds of nationalist rivalries. This does not solve all of the problems that had existed there. There were all kinds of disputes over political boundaries, the communist influence that comes from neighboring Russia, of course, nationalist rivalries that will exist over this. This goes on for the next 80 years, until the year 2000, in fact. And even then, even today, there's still a military presence that has to exist in the Balkans today in order to try to keep some of the peace. So this isn't really history. This is actually still happening today. So here's a map of Europe before World War I, and pay close attention here. You see Austria-Hungary is giant, right? And it borders the sea. You've got small Romania, and here you've got the Balkan states as well, just across the Adriatic Sea from Italy. You will also notice there's no Poland. Poland does not exist on this map. And also notice the Ottoman Empire here is still intact. So here's what Europe looks like after World War I. Notice Romania suddenly got a lot bigger, as did Czechoslovakia, and Poland exists. And not only does Poland exist, it's huge. We'll talk about why that is as well. Germany was reduced in size, as you can see. Austria, a very small landlocked country at this point, as well as Hungary. So Austria and Hungary have basically become fairly powerless in Europe at this point, which is something that Germany will later exploit as well. And take a look at Czechoslovakia as it kind of intrudes here into the borders of Germany and Central Europe as well. Also notice these new states that didn't exist before, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All of these states will become targets during World War II for both Germany under the rule of Adolf Hitler and the Soviet Union under the rule of Joseph Stalin. They are not happy with the way this map looks, and they both believe that these areas rightfully belong to them, which is why, of course, much of World War II's most horrific fighting takes place there. But let's talk a little bit about this peace settlement, because after all, the peace settlement was supposed to bring peace, right? So instead, it seems to lead directly to the other big war. In fact, an even bigger one, the biggest war the world has ever seen, which is World War II. So what went wrong with the Paris Peace Conference of 1919? Well, there were many participants in this Paris Peace Conference, and they all had their own objectives and agenda when they show up. So when the peace is finally settled, it doesn't really seem like the final settlement really reflects everybody's objectives. Some countries get a lot of what they want. Many countries get nothing of what they want. And in the end, everybody basically agrees to blame one country and try to essentially get away with not paying or not accepting blame for themselves. So let's look at these peace aims. First of all, when the Paris Peace Conference begins, the star of the show is Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. In fact, when Wilson arrives in France, in Paris, they throw him a parade. None of the other leaders got a parade, just Woodrow Wilson of the United States. His name was in lights and everything. So he feels like a celebrity anyway. And this is great for Woodrow Wilson because he didn't have a lot of great experience in foreign policy. His first couple attempts at foreign policy hadn't gone very well. So for him to arrive in Paris and have a parade thrown for him and his name is in lights is like, it really boosts his confidence a lot. And when he arrives, he has a plan called the 14 points. You have a copy of the 14 points in your reading packet, and you can see they're pretty short. You can see for yourselves some of the things that he wants to establish in Europe. But basically, he tries to make it so that World War I was truly the war to end all wars, which a more ironic statement in history I don't think has ever been said. But he wants to make it a war against absolutism and militarism. He hopes that something that will come out of this war will be a lesson, a moral story. Hopefully these men didn't die for nothing. Hopefully we've learned something from it, which is an admirable thing to say, certainly. And actually his 14 points were very idealistic. They were not bad ideas. They were simply not based in the reality of what Europe was at the time. Some of the 14 points were things like, we shouldn't have secret treaties. That's a good idea, no secret treaties. However, these countries don't trust each other, so of course they're going to have secret treaties. He also wants every country to reduce its military size. Fair enough, since after all, one of the causes of the war had been militarism and the expansion of the militaries. But if anything, World War I had actually increased and advanced the technology use in war. And so with that advancement in technology, trying to reduce the military itself was, some might say, unrealistic. He also wants self-determination or self-rule for all people in Europe. He does not believe that one European country should try to rule over another. Sounds good as well, right? Every European country, after all, wants to be free. Now, notice, though, this does not apply to colonies. However, colonies were listening to this. Colonies tuned in to read Wilson's 14 points, and they thought, hey, this idea of self-rule sounds pretty good. We'd like some of that, too. Of course, this does not apply to colonies at this time. Also, don't forget, America had colonies as well. We had the Philippines and Puerto Rico, Guam, And the United States was also not willing to let its own colonies go at the time. But colonial peoples, they become very angry when they realize that that point does not apply to them. His final 14th point, and this is truly the one he was probably the most passionate about, it was his baby, was the creation of the League of Nations. Wilson wants to create a body of, an international body of countries that will come together through diplomacy to solve their problems peacefully. And this would be called the League of Nations. And this League of Nations would be responsible for maintaining peace, for resolving conflicts, and for overall just genuine peaceful diplomacy. It sounded like a pretty good idea to many people at the time, especially because World War I had been so horrible. Everybody hoped never to experience anything like that again. So the idea of resolving issues peacefully sounded pretty good. However, many countries were not so keen on many of his 14 points. For example, in Britain, you have David Lloyd George, this guy right here. David Lloyd George, he is very concerned with the economy. He wants Europe's economy to recover, but he also wants Germany to pay because Britain blames Germany mostly for the war. After all, it had been Germany that had really egged Austria on. It had been Germany that had been provoking France by trying to start revolutions in its colonies. Germany had seemed to be the country that had been trying to prove something to everyone else. And of course, the British lose so many men to German machine guns during the war that David Lloyd George wants Germany to pay for this. But even more, Georges Clemenceau of France. Georges Clemenceau of France is bent on revenge against Germany. First of all, France shares a border with Germany, and so France is very concerned about national security. France wants to make sure that Germany can never do this again, can never do what it has done, cannot be a threat to France anymore. But also, France wants revenge. After all, most of the damage that happened in the war, most of the war took place in France. So France has received the brunt of the damages in the war, and they also want revenge against Germany because they feel Germany had been the most provocative, the most belligerent, and also, they still want Alsace-Lorraine back. Another thing that happens as a result of, the pragmatism or the realistic situation in Europe, as opposed to Wilson's 14 points, is that now everybody in Europe is afraid of a Bolshevik revolution happening in their country. The fear of communism spreading was very real. So this actually led the Allies to strengthen and enlarge Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. So go back to this map. Poland, right, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, three countries that really, they sort of divide Russia from the rest of Europe. And notice how huge they are, especially Poland. And also keep in mind that these countries were fairly new. They hadn't really existed. So as a result, later on, Hitler will look at Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania and will decide those should rightfully belong to the German Empire. So this is why he invades them. The first countries he will invade and take over when he starts World War II will start with Austria, Czechoslovakia, and then Poland. And then soon after invading Poland, he'll also take Romania. So it's important to note that Hitler had his own reasons, I should say, for why he did what he did, for the reasons why he picked on the particular countries he picked on. At the Paris Peace Conference, which, by the way, actually takes place at the Palace of Versailles, the famous palace that Louis XIV built to show off France's majesty and power. France gets to host this. And so, of course, they choose their finest palace in order to do this. Perhaps this was also a political move on France's part, not just because it was big enough to house everyone and just a convenient place to have the peace conference, but Versailles is a symbol of France's wealth and power. And so this is, of course, seen as a move by the French. There were 27 nations represented, but it's dominated by the big three. The big three are Britain, France, and the United States. Italy also kind of is part of that club, has a small role, but it is mostly Britain, France, and the United States. Interesting, considering that the United States didn't even was not part of the beginning of this, and actually didn't even participate until the last 10 months. So a lot of other states were represented, but they couldn't participate in any of the decisions, mainly because they were the losers, like Germany, Austria, Hungary. Russia was not represented, or the Soviet Union was not represented at all because it had withdrawn from the war. And there were some that were not even represented at all, but they had played a role in the war. For example, Ireland was not represented, even though it had lost hundreds of thousands of men to the war. Why? Well, in 1916, Ireland had its own rising, and Ireland had a revolution in which it declared independence from Britain. So Ireland was not invited to participate. It was a little busy with its own affairs. Anyway, Vietnam surprisingly also plays a role in this. Vietnamese troops had also fought in the war. Vietnam was a French colony, but was not invited to participate. So, in the end, an agreement is reached. This is the Treaty of Versailles. The compromise was the League of Nations was established. This is pretty much the only one of the 14 points that all of them can agree on. So Wilson gets almost none of his 14 points agreed to, except for this one, the League of Nations. And the rest of the rest of the agreement seemed to be all about punishing Germany. Germany was punished in many ways. First of all, the Rhineland, which is the border between France and Germany, would be militarized, meaning that it would be protected. France and Britain made an alliance, and together they continued their alliance, and they also forced Germany to reduce the size of its military. So it's finally signed on June 9th of 1919, and these are all of the clauses. Article 231 was the most hated of these. It was the war guilt clause. Germany was actually forced to admit to having complete responsibility of the war, being 100% responsible, and was forced to pay the reparations. When the people of Germany first heard about the amount that they would have to pay, people actually laughed because it was completely ridiculous to expect a country that had literally zero money to pay for this war. And we're talking about an amount of money that's in the trillions. I mean, nobody had that kind of money, let alone Germany. And also making Germany simply admit to guilt seemed very petty at the time. They also were forced to reduce their army down to only 100,000 men, which is fairly small for a country that big. Germany was forced to return Alsace and Lorraine back to France. Germany lost all of its colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Most of them were given over to either Britain or France. Very few of them actually went free. Some parts of what used to be Prussia were actually given to the new Polish state. So this is another reason why Hitler is so hell-bent on invading Poland. Poland actually contained much of the land that Hitler had felt was rightfully Germany's and had been robbed or stolen from them by the Treaty of Versailles. And then, of course, the demilitarized zone, which is the Rhineland, the border of France and Germany. This actually makes countries incredibly satisfied, except for Germany. Some countries were concerned that it was a bit harsh. America is not really happy with the Treaty of Versailles. But this actually makes Germany incredibly unhappy and angry and resentful, especially as they actually believe that Germany has been forced to this dictated peace that was orchestrated by what many of them viewed as Marxist Jews. Interestingly enough, there were very few Jewish people involved in this at all. There were very few Marxists involved in this at all. In fact, if anything, this was actually orchestrated by the rest of Europe, who did not want to admit responsibility or pay for the war itself. Also, I think it's important to note that the United States is very unhappy with this Treaty of Versailles, and so they decide not to. The United States Congress does not ratify it. This includes the League of Nations. So, in another twist of irony, the only country that did not join the League of Nations was the United States, the very country that came up with the idea for it, right? The American president is the one who created the idea, and then America won't back him up, will not join. The reason why, of course, was that Congress believed that joining the League of Nations would make America beholden to other countries' affairs, and Congress wanted nothing to do with that. Poor Woodrow Wilson, he traveled around the United States trying to campaign for all of these states to agree to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and it never happened. The stress was so much for him, in fact, he ended up having a stroke and dying from all the stress. So there were a lot of culminating effects as well. This is a photograph of Woodrow Wilson. He's right here in the middle, along with David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau of Britain and France. Shortly after signing the Treaty of Versailles, notice they look fairly satisfied. Well, kind of. Woodrow Wilson probably is not smiling, but you see the rest of them are. I implore you to read that report in your reading packet where the Germans are informed of the treaty. It goes on to talk about the awkwardness, the resentfulness, the tension in the air. Goes to show you exactly what the Germans thought. After the treaty was signed, there was a lot of German propaganda that was anti everyone else. And this is an example of a horribly racist and horrific cartoon that this is how a lot of Germans felt. And this, of course, fans the flames of racism in Germany and anti-Semitism as well. But Germans found it very easy at this point to use things like race and religion to set themselves apart from the rest of Europe, especially since they felt that they had been so unjustly treated by the rest of Europe during this time. So this is actually a German satirical magazine cartoon that was published in Munich. And you see the person who is tied to the tree with its hands behind its back it represents the German people, and he's like skinny and emaciating, implying that he's starving. Meanwhile, the fat man that is holding his hands behind his back represents Britain, and he has a smile on his face. And interestingly enough, the person that is kicking him in the stomach is actually a very racist caricature of a black man who represents the Republic of France. That's the RF on his shorts, and he's a boxer, and he's unfairly kicking Germany in the stomach. Now, this could be having to do with the African colonies that France had and how France uses its African colonies to punish Germany as well. But as you can see, cartoons like this become very popular. Germans found this fairly simply easy to accept that this is how they had been treated, because indeed this is how many of them felt. So there's other peace treaties as well that also are not very popular, although not as unpopular as the Treaty of Versailles, but this is going to drop some serious territorial changes. For example, this has a lot to do with German and Russian losses and Romanian gains. So don't forget, both Germany and Russia lose territory during World War I. They both try to reclaim it under the leadership of Stalin and Hitler during World War II. There's new countries that exist now in Europe, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia are all countries that didn't exist before, and now they did. And every single Eastern European state had its own sector of ethnic minorities or religious minorities that were living all across Europe, because, of course, these new political boundaries, people had already been living there, and when the boundaries were drawn, they were just drawn where they were, right? So, like, if let's say you are a Russian Jewish person, but you're actually living in Hungary when this happens, or let's say you are Austrian, but you were living in what is now Yugoslavia when this happened. So now all of a sudden, bam, you're just a minority because of where you live and now the new political boundaries around your country and what it calls itself. Suddenly, you're a minority, even though you had been living there your whole life. So this leads to, of course, minorities being treated badly. They are seen as others. They're going to be persecuted, many of them, for their loyalties wherever they may have lain. The Ottoman Empire is gone. It's dismembered. And there were some promises of independence in the Middle East at this time. But instead of becoming independent, much of the Ottoman Empire is basically picked apart by mostly Britain and France. Britain and France view this as an opportunity. For one, the Middle East was had recently been discovered to be very oil rich. And with the new technology of cars, of course, both Britain and France want their hands on some of that oil. So they create instead in the Middle East what are called mandates, which are basically like colonies. The difference is that it's not technically under the it's not a colony in the sense that they come and try to impose a new government on these countries, but rather they are militarily occupied. So France takes Lebanon and Syria, and Britain takes Iraq and Palestine. Now, these were actually all new countries that hadn't technically existed before, but now these new borders were created, and many of them had to do with land that was either religiously significant, for example, Palestine, or was rich in resources like oil, such as Iraq. So many people are very angry about the way that the World War I was settled. Certainly, people in the Middle East were very angry. Notice, by the way, that Britain and France have colonized much of the Middle East, and the Middle East doesn't really approve of this. So when World War II breaks out, some of these places will actually side with Germany, which is pretty interesting, considering that Hitler would not have accepted these people into his own country. So this becomes very difficult to enforce later on, as this creates more revolutions and more revolts and more difficulties and conflicts, and the world seems ripe for another conflict. So really, many people viewed this as it was just a matter of time until this would all blow up in everybody's face. And like I said, to make matters worse, the United States never did ratify the Versailles Treaty. When I say it makes matters worse, it just means it led to the disunity. The Versailles Treaty itself, in my opinion, was probably really unfair, and the United States was right not to ratify it. However, it would have been easier if it just hadn't actually been written that way in the first place. So that being said, guys, here's, by the way, a map of the Middle East. That being said, I'm leaving you here with this, and I will be placing this in Google Classroom with a question for you guys to answer as well. I want you guys to think about the way World War I ended, the way the blame was assigned to Germany altogether, and how things could have possibly ended differently. Was there any way that World War II perhaps could have been avoided, or do you think it was inevitable no matter how World War I ended? It's a difficult question. I don't really have an answer for you. But what I do know is that when World War I ends, it ends with a lot of unfinished business, but under the guise of some sort of peace settlement. And in fact, it doesn't work out at all. I'm leaving you here with this final timeline so that you guys can see how everything sort of escalates very quickly, including, of course, starting with the assassination of Britain, the First Battle of the Marne, the Second Battle of the Marne, the Easter Rebellion, the Easter Rising of 1916 in Ireland, and then the final entry of the United States, which happens to coincide almost at the same time as the war and the revolution in Russia. Okay, guys. Next time I talk to you will be a Zoom meeting probably, but I plan on having another one of these in which I will talk about the 1920s and 1930s and the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you all as soon as this is all over.